Hey, Dr. Stevenson, how are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
That's an absolute pleasure. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your academic history? Now, obviously, we know about this. We actually go back quite a ways, but for our audience, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, of course. So I grew up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and I studied music as an undergraduate. So I always like to tell my students that you can find your love for theology later in life. So yeah, I studied music in Denver, Colorado, and was a worship pastor for a number of years, which led me to ask a bunch of theological questions and eventually to theological graduate school. And so then I ended up in Vancouver at Regent College, where I met you guys. I did an MA and THM there in theology, had a great experience at Regent, and then went to Cambridge, where Jonathan came along with a whole Regent crew. And that was great. Did my PhD there. And then most recently, I was a junior research fellow at Oxford before coming back to the States after 10 years away, and I'm assistant professor of theology at Palm Beach Atlantic University now.
Switching from Cambridge to Oxford is a good move up for you, I think.
Boo!
Yeah,
Well, I love.
Boo!
I think one of my favorite experiences is Austin. Jonathan and I all had a class together, Archie Spencer's theological method class, and then
yeah,
I got assigned a paper on Eberhard Jungel, this relatively unknown German theologian. And I think it was you, Austin, who convinced me to title the paper the Jungel Book, where it's spelled like jungle, but the E and the L are inverted, so it's the Jungel Book. And then you actually and then I got encouraged to publish it. So my first published paper ever for the rest of my academic career will be titled the Jungel Book.
that sounds fitting. Yeah, that was Jonathan's favorite class of all time.
Don't get me started. We'll have to cut. We'll have to cut this whole section out if I get started on that class. So
Yeah,
so
it was a significant class for all of us, I think. And in some ways, it's in the background of my book, which we're going to talk about today. I think that class played a big role in sort of where I've ended up in terms of my research. Yeah.
I'm glad your paper you were able to get a lot more mileage out of it. I'm not sure I've touched Eberhard Jungel since that day, to be completely honest.
Yeah, I think after
no.
hearing your paper, none of us have ever touched Jungel again.
Amen.
You ruined up. Well, we've
That
that
was the goal.
background. Well, what is your work? Could you tell us a little bit about your new book, The Consciousness of the Historical Jesus, and what it is and what motivated you to write it?
Yeah, so the book just recently came out last month, I guess, with T&T Clark, and it's cool. It's in the series Studies in Systematic Theology, which is great because I think it was the first book in that series is by Michael Allen, and it's engaging with similar questions, the question of whether Christ had faith. And so this is in some ways a response to that book, but it's cool to have it in the same series. So this book, in some ways, I think the concept for the book or the questions behind the book go back about a decade. So during my time at Regent early on, and they really begin with reading N.T. Wright in Rick Watts's class, New Testament. We read New Testament and the People of God in that class, and I loved it. And so then I bought all of Tom's other books, and I was reading the next volume, Jesus and the Victory of God. And right near the end of that book, he says that Jesus didn't know he was God. And so I circled that and put a big question mark next to it and said, what? I have no idea what to do with this. And is that true? Is that a problem? And then I proceeded to pester all of our professors at Regent with that question whenever we even tangentially touched on it in class. And so that kind of began a series of sort of questions for me that were tied to two other big maybe rifts that were present at Regent or that people were really wrestling with. So one was, what's the relationship between biblical studies and systematic theology? These were big debates happening at Regent between those sort of different disciplines. And I really liked both disciplines and was trying to find a way to sort of bring them together. And then the question of the relationship between philosophy and theology. So we were all together. That seminar that we took together was on Barth and his rejection of the analogy of being in metaphysics. And so those were kind of big questions, I think, for a lot of us about how do we relate these sorts of disciplines. And for me, I think I was a big fan of Bart all through kind of undergrad and up through master's until basically that seminar when I decided I don't think he's right about this. And so that led me to then want to read more of the classical tradition that preceded him. And so all of those kind of questions converged for me on this question um, of sort of Jesus self-understanding and Christology and historical Jesus scholarship. So that's the kind of backstory that leads into this project. And in the book, my big question is what counts as a historical perspective when it comes to Jesus and why? And I essentially argue that we should think of classical Christology and historical Jesus scholarship as rival traditions of historical inquiry. And so that's a kind of reframing, whereas people often think of historical Jesus scholarship as a kind of scientific objective take on Jesus, and classical Christology as a kind of biased dogmatic take on Jesus. And I'm saying, in a sense, both of them are somewhat critical, but also traditional takes. In other words, there's a sort of ongoing discussion that has a set of philosophical presuppositions built into it, and a sort of set of lenses of how to ask and answer questions about Jesus, and that these are essentially two versions of that kind of thing. So I in the book I sort of look at how that is the case for both of them and what it might mean to think critically about Jesus as a historical figure, with kind of different philosophical presuppositions than historical Jesus scholars have tended to have.
So, to kind of summarize, then, when I open up a commentary that's written by some New Testament scholar, it's operating with a different philosophy, a different set of assumptions than when I open up, say, a theology book, which is dealing with the councils and what we believe as Christians about Jesus Christ historically. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, often. I mean, and it's complicated, right? Because I'm not saying that the scholar who wrote that has different beliefs or even philosophical beliefs necessarily, but that they're employing a set of methods that were built upon a certain set of philosophical assumptions that are at odds with the philosophical assumptions of the classical Christian tradition. And so those are usually implicit. Often they're very unaware of them, but part of what I'm trying to do is kind of unearth what those are and the ways in which they impact what those scholars end up saying.
So let's jump into it. What are some of these unexamined assumptions, this philosophical tradition?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of things that we could say. Most simply, I kind of frame it as a form of naturalism, and I think when you say that, people just assume that you mean, oh, they don't believe in miracles, and that's true, but that's not really what I'm most interested in. So instead, I'm thinking about the sort of deeper level metaphysical assumptions that have to do with, for example, what does it mean to be a human person? And how does this sort of classical Christian tradition think about that philosophically versus how does this kind of modern tradition think about that? And what does it mean to know things? So what is knowledge? What is truth? And so thinking particularly, a lot of this tradition is developed in the context of German idealism, and so thinking about what's the difference between what knowledge means in that context versus a sort of classical philosophical realism. What are the sort of if we think about like medieval cognitive theory as a sort of way of talking about how minds work and what the powers of the soul are and that kind of thing, versus a contemporary discussion about kind of psychology, the sort of experience of knowing that kind of thing. I'm sort of just saying these are very different conversations, but they're being assumed at times when we then talk about Jesus. So when people say, what did Jesus know, for example, one of these kinds of frameworks is just being assumed in sort of how those questions are asked and answered. And that impacts heavily what then can be said. Or when we say that Jesus was fully human, which both the Christian tradition does and historians do, we mean really different things by human. And so then that has a big impact on how we then go about thinking about Jesus. So those are the kind of main focus of what I talk about. The other thing is to say that even the way that Christology gets characterized is impacted by these philosophical assumptions. So when historians, when historical Jesus scholars, they talk about classical Christology all the time, and they're almost always wrong about what it means because they're reading it through the lens of a different metaphysic. So they're, for example, assuming that God and creatures exist in a competitive relationship, and that when we say that Jesus is divine, we're trying to say that he's not human. So the way that they paint those kinds of theological claims are inaccurate. And so some of the book is just saying, here's what they're actually saying in Christology, but also how does that impact sort of what it means to think about Jesus historically.
So essentially what you're saying then is, as you say it, there's this competitive relationship, and to be divine also means not to be human. So it's nearly like a theological critique of history. Is that right then?
Yeah, I think that's right. So, yeah, it's in many ways it's saying this tradition, kind of classical Christian tradition, I take as a tradition of historical inquiry. In other words, I think that Christianity has always been deeply interested in critical historical questions about Jesus, but they go about asking and answering them differently. Whereas modern historicism is its own kind of rival tradition. And so it's not so much just saying, well, from the perspective of the classical tradition, this tradition of modern historicism is wrong, but rather it's subjective, and it hasn't asked deep questions about all of its assumptions, right? And so it's a slightly more complex kind of argument that I'm trying to make, because it would be easy for Christians to just say what the historians are saying doesn't align with my beliefs. And that's true, but that's not as interesting. But kind of why is that the case? What do we do about that if we don't just want to reject the importance of history, right? And so that's kind of what I'm trying to get at is how can we engage really well with critical history without taking on board the philosophical assumptions that haven't been defended, that often aren't even explicit, but nonetheless kind of determine the outcomes of the conversation.
So it's sort of like traditionally people have thought there's this Jesus of faith and there's this Jesus of history. And the Jesus of faith is devotional, personal. It's the old lady in the church just reading the Psalms and praying to Jesus, and a very pure, humble, innocent, unintellectual faith. And then there's allegedly this Jesus of history. And that's the factual, objective, modern, scientifically rigorous, archaeologically astute Jesus that we can actually prove using facts. And there's this sense that you're coming along and saying, well, actually, the Jesus of faith, the Jesus of the Christian tradition, has always been grounded in history. We've always had historical conversations. The Jesus of faith is historical in that sense. And this alleged historical Jesus of facts isn't just the facts. There's a set of assumptions and worldviews and philosophical presuppositions. So it's not that one is objective and the other is subjective. It's actually that the subjective one is a bit more objective than you thought, and the objective one is a bit more subjective than you thought. And these are actually kind of like two different ways of seeing him, but it's not like one is more factual than the other. They're both coming to it with a set of assumptions. That's kind of what we're getting at. Am I right about that?
That's exactly right. Yeah, absolutely. And the way that I go about framing that is in conversation with Alistair McIntyre and how he talks about tradition. And if we don't need to get in the academic weeds of that, but that's kind of how I think about it. But it's that way of saying exactly what you said, right? And what's I think helpful about that is it allows us to then say, well, what does it look like for rival traditions to have a genuine conversation with one another, rather than just assuming the priority of one over the other? And I think that puts us in a much better space to then have a dialogue between those, because it's often been people who sort of accept the Jesus of faith, just rejecting critical history altogether and saying, I don't want to ask questions about that. I know what I believe. And people who assume that the Jesus of history is an objective fact, just sort of saying, well, people who don't accept this are stupid. Christians, don't care about the truth. They just care about their dogma. And that, I just think that doesn't capture the reality, right? So and so part of this is to say, we can't just know scientifically what happened in the past, right? That would be great. Like this idea of the Jesus of history that we can prove for a fact, using scientific methods, this is what happened, that would be cool. And I get why people want that, especially in the wake of people who have experienced abuse from religious communities or these kinds of things. They often turn to that as a way of saying, I can prove that everything that you've done to me is based on a lie, and this whole faith is based on a lie. But we can't prove one way or another anything in that way. We have to ask more complex questions about reality, and it's always going to be sort of messy, right? And so I think to do justice to the complexity of how we ask those questions, we need to frame it in these other ways. And so then that does allow us to say, historical Jesus scholarship is important, but it's not objective, it's not scientific. And it's actually very similar to the kinds of things that the Christian tradition has been doing all along.
Do you think that this historical quest is still going on? Are people still attempting this, even with a recognition that no two scholars come out of this seeing the same Jesus?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. It is still going on. I think we're probably in a period where people are less sure of themselves than they were, say, maybe 10 years ago with some of the projects that were coming out. So a number of the kind of leading historical Jesus scholars have kind of reached the end of their careers, and we don't necessarily have people coming up who are maybe investing as much into this, but it's still an ongoing project. And I think it's kind of necessarily an ongoing project because this stands at the heart of really New Testament studies as a whole, right? If you're a Paul scholar or whatever else you're doing, you're assuming something about the historical Jesus, about his relationship to these other figures, all these kinds of questions, the dating, all of that stuff. And so I think it inevitably kind of continues, even though people are pretty uncomfortable, to my mind, with the state of this discipline in particular. And so, some of the recent stuff has been thinking about, should they start considering the Gospel of John? Historically, in the past, historical Jesus scholars never include John as sort of evidence for Jesus, only the synoptics. So that's been a kind of piece of some recent stuff. But yeah, so I think it's at a strange point right now, this scholarship, but I think it's kind of inevitably going to continue. And the question is just sort of in what form is it going to do that?
So, kind of following up on that, even though they're seemingly very disparate, very different in their conclusions, it seems like what your book is trying to do is show that there still is some sort of presumption that's driving that, which is this naturalism, which is this idea that if Jesus is God, then he can't be human, but he's obviously human. So, when you do your theological, in a sense, critique of this, how does this change everything about how we do scholarship?
Yeah, so that's what's really interesting, was interesting for me, because I, kind of sat down with this giant stack of historical Jesus, books and just read through them. And despite being really different in their kind of conclusions and in their personal beliefs and in so many things, they do really share in common a lot of kind of basic assumptions in their approach. And one of the main ones that I talk about is just the assumptions about Jesus' self-understanding. So, um, if we think about how we do history, people often kind of think of history as being about dates and facts and like this happened at this time and blah blah blah. But at the heart of kind of the discipline of history is thinking about what Collingwood calls the inside of history. So, why did this person do this thing at this point in time? What was their motivation? What did they think they were going to accomplish? How did they understand themselves? Like, we're often trying to get to those deep questions to then understand the kind of the causation of these events, right? That why this person did this for this reason and then it had this outcome. And so when we go back to think about Jesus as a historical figure, that's really central to most of what they're doing, is trying to reconstruct, who did Jesus actually think he was? What was he trying to accomplish? What caused the major events in his life? Like, for example, why was he executed? Why did he give the kind of speeches that he did? Why did he associate with the people that he did? And so they're asking these questions about his kind of self-understanding. And what's interesting is that they universally begin with the assumption that Jesus could not have had, say, a divine self-understanding, could not have had even a messianic understanding and anything beyond purely political. And so these kinds of assumptions are just baked in, and they'll say things like, well, I don't know any human who's sane who could think that about themselves, so they can't. Right? And that's just built in. And I think that from a theological perspective, it's not a neutral assumption, because it assumes that if Jesus did know he was divine, that means he wasn't really human, that he was this weird, crazy figure, or that he was like, this, that he was like God, just like floating around. He's this like kind of ghostly figure or something. And they're all like, well, he wasn't that, so therefore he just thought the same way that you and I do, and understood himself the same way that you and I do. And so even kind of, really committed Christians who do this work, they always still begin with that. I mean, N.T. Wright, for example, says, Jesus didn't know he was God, in a straightforward way, at least. And so that's my kind of way into these questions, is to say, where's that assumption coming from? What are the assumptions about knowledge, about, the relationship between divine and human causation, all these kinds of things. And so then what I do in the book is kind of unpack, what's the Christology behind that? So if you say, if Jesus is human, he couldn't have known he was God, what are the kind of Christological assumptions? But also then, what does the Christian tradition think about this? What does the Christian tradition claim, right, about sort of Jesus knowledge? And that's not as straightforward as people think. For example, classically, the Christian tradition affirms divine simplicity. And so they would say the divine essence is identical with divine knowledge, and therefore a human couldn't possess divine knowledge. And so they deny that Jesus in his humanity possessed divine knowledge. I think people would be surprised by that, because they just assume that Christians think, oh yeah, Jesus, had divine omniscience and he knew everything. And so I sort of unpack the fact that that's not true for this tradition, and instead, what are the kind of human ways of knowing that they apply to Jesus, but that some of those do include things like supernatural prophetic knowledge, for example. Right? And so this is a space of difference, is that historical Jesus scholars will say Jesus saw himself as a prophet, but they always assume he was not a prophet. Whereas the Christian tradition says, well, what if he was a prophet? What does that mean, right? What if he actually had prophetic knowledge? And so that's a place where the Christianity is going to end up with different conclusions, because they're willing to ask the question, well, what if he was a prophet? What if the claims in these texts are true? Whereas the historical Jesus scholars always begin with a set of, we know that the claims aren't true, so what could be the case instead, right? And so some of what I'm doing is just showing how that's not neutral either way. And so we have to sort of ask deeper questions.
So, I mean, there's this critical aspect of your project where you're critiquing everyone else's proposal for Jesus' self-understanding and what he thought of himself. Is there a positive aspect where you come in and say, what, maybe Jesus thought this about himself? Like, maybe he's 8 and he's like, oh, I'm God. Like, what is there an alternative you're putting in place, or are you just tearing down and opening up the conversation?
Yeah, so I'm certainly, I think a lot of the project is actually more constructive than just tearing down. So, and including here, what basically I spend a lot of the book unpacking. I use Thomas Aquinas as a kind of example of the classical tradition, and in part because he writes so much about Jesus' knowledge in his Christology. That's really helpful. And so I kind of unpack that. What does that mean, and what are the implications of that for doing history? And so for Aquinas, there's a kind of fourfold knowledge that he talks about. So he says that Jesus had acquired knowledge. Interestingly, a lot of the theologians that preceded Aquinas denied this. So they said Jesus couldn't learn things through his kind of senses and intellect, that he would have already known all the things that he knew. But Aquinas says actually he would need to learn. So he had acquired knowledge. Jesus learned things through his lifetime. And what's really important about that is it contextualizes Jesus within his historical context, right? So it says the way that he would have thought and spoken is in terms of the kind of language and idioms and culture of his context. And I think that's really significant, because it says if you want to understand Jesus, right, the stuff he says may have universal significance, but it's not universal. It's speaking into a specific context. And even his understanding of it would have been through the kind of lens of that specific context. So I think that's really significant. But then beyond that, we have this this kind of threefold mode of supernatural knowledge. And so he denies that Christ had divine knowledge in his humanity, like I said, but he says Christ had prophetic knowledge. And so, again, just sort of taking seriously the prophetic tradition from the Old Testament and saying, as Christians, we believe that there are prophets, that God can speak to prophets, but he does so, again, according to a way that they can understand it. So this isn't sort of universal knowledge, and it's not knowledge in the way that divine, like God knows things, but it's a communication of knowledge to a specific person in a specific context, in the kind of language and concepts that they can understand, and usually for a specific purpose, right? And so he says that Christ had this what he calls infused knowledge, but prophetic knowledge. And then beyond that, Aquinas argues that Christ possessed the beatific vision, which is the sort of eschatological vision of God that we're all promised in the hereafter, that we will see God and be like Him. And this, I connect this to this idea of Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet, which a lot of historical Jesus scholars today see him as an apocalyptic prophet. And what's really interesting about this is that, again, they all assume that he wasn't. But if you assume that he actually was, right, so that he wasn't just claiming to be an apocalyptic prophet, or he wasn't, right, making this stuff up, then what we see in these kind of apocalyptic figures is they have a kind of vision of the kingdom of God, right? They have a sort of vision of heaven that they can't conceptualize really. So like even Paul, right, says like he was taken up to the third heaven, and he tries to communicate what he saw, but he also says he can't really do that. I think that's the kind of category that we have in mind here for Jesus sort of possessing the beatific vision, that he has this kind of apocalyptic vision of God, which enables him to know things, but not in a kind of communicable way necessarily. And so Aquinas sort of unpacks this with kind of all kind of detailed Christological arguments. But I think partly what this allows us to do is it allows us to better affirm the unity of who Christ is from a Christological perspective. So, for example, Chalcedon says that Christ was a divine person in a human nature. And if in his human nature he didn't know who he was, then it's hard not to end up with Nestorianism, which is two Christs, right? That you sort of have this human Christ who's doing one thing, and he technically is this divine person who's doing this other thing, and they don't know about each other. That's sort of hard to square Christologically. And so what's important about this kind of claim is to say that this is how Christ sort of possesses his own divine identity and knows who he is. But it's in this kind of deep, inexpressible, kind of supernatural vein, right? And so that I think unpacks some things in interesting ways, where we can say things like, I think that Jesus could have sort of had a supernatural insight about his divine identity, about his sort of messianic calling and mission, but not in the same way that I would say, therefore, he's just like sitting around thinking about how he knows who was going to win the World Cup in the 21st century, or, that he knows all the languages that ever existed or whatever. Right. So I think we want to avoid a kind of sense of, this makes Jesus just not human, right? It's just not believably human. But also it enables us to retain a sense of, and yet he has a sort of particular identity and a self-understanding that sort of goes beyond what would be typical. And then the key thing here is Aquinas says that grace does not destroy nature but perfects it, right? So if these are sort of a work of grace, then that makes him more human, not less human from a Christian perspective. Whereas often historical Jesus scholars are saying, if any of this is true of Jesus, then he's not human, right? So there's a different perspective on sort of nature and grace happening here as well.
So that was an amazing sort of theological explanation of what's going on here. I know you read a lot of novels. And so I'm going to put you on the spot here and say, okay, there's a lot of theory going in there to what Jesus did or didn't know. But I think what a lot of people, especially in the pew, really struggle with is, how do I actually picture this as a character?
Mm.
Who is this 10-year-old Jesus who knows all of this, but's also a 10-year-old freaking kid and experiencing life in a way that's authentic to the human experience of a 10-year-old? Like, how do you tell this story in sort of that character way? Like, if you could almost practically describe who this person is, like waking up in the morning and going to Jewish Hebrew school, like what does that look like on a practical level?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's a difficult one. I think eh, on the one hand, I want to say that the Christian tradition often uses metaphysical categories instead of experiential ones because we can say, that Jesus was ontologically human and divine, but it's very speculative to say what it would have felt like to be God incarnate. Right? And so there's a kind of pernicious speculativeness to this where I would want to say, I have no idea what that would feel like. And it'd be silly for me to pretend. But on the other hand, I do think it's important to say, are the claims that we're making about Christ conceivable within, what the human life? What does that look like? So to sort of branch out speculatively, which I do argue in the book we shouldn't do, um, I would want to say, I would want to follow, again, another principle that I draw from Aquinas in this book is the received is in the receiver according to the mode of the receiver. And so that means that the sort of knowledge and understanding and experience that Christ receives in his humanity is according to the mode of his humanity, including the sort of developmental context of his humanity at various points. And so, right, so the idea here is, right, as an infant, he wouldn't be able to receive much into his intellect in terms of conceptual categories or concrete whatever, and that's fine. And as he develops more and grows, he can sort of receive more in a mode that he could sort of articulate and understand, right? And so again, this isn't like Jesus just sort of staring off blankly and floating around, but rather as he develops as a human, he has a kind of deep sense, a sort of, right, this sort of a spiritual sense. So like, this would be, I think maybe the best way to think about this is in terms of the examples that we have in history of like the saints or the contemplatives, right? So people who sort of had this deep spiritual life and what that looked like. I think those are the kinds of categories we would want to use as like a parallel or an analogy, and see Jesus as sort of that kind of person, right? That's sort of what's happening here.
Someone who has this sort of elevated spiritual experience, but also has to eat and go to the bathroom and sweats and these types of things. And somehow those things are compatible there. So let's export that to a heightened version with Jesus.
Yep,
Kind
exactly
of.
right. That's exactly right. So, I think oftentimes people say, well, Jesus was human, so he's just like us. And I want to say, well, not like me, but like humans, right? Like, do we have human examples of something like this? And we do. If we kind of take those seriously, these kind of claims throughout history of people who have had this kind of elevated spiritual experience, who people who were deeply virtuous, that kind of thing. I think that's the kind of framework that I would want to think, and the fact that those things don't make them any less human. And from a theological perspective, they make them more human, right? That's what we all sort of hope to become or are promised to become one day.
So this might shock a lot of people, or maybe they haven't even thought about it, but Jesus learned as he grew up that he was God. Then is that essentially what you're saying?
I think in a sense, I would want to say that he probably, like, certainly Aquinas would say that, like, from conception, as far as you can have a sense of self, he had a divine sense of self. But he certainly grew in his sense of what that meant and how to articulate that and what that connected with things. Right. So I think it's important to say, like, from a Chalcedonian perspective, it was the person of the Son, the eternal person of the Son, that was this human person, right? So it's the Word of God in a human mode living, but it's in a human mode. So that, right, his identity, who he was always sort of God. But what that looks like in a human mode probably entails some development in terms of kind of human understanding and articulability and conceptual clarity, right? So
Mhm.
that would be, I think, the kind of idea here is trying to hold those two things together, which is really what Chalcedon's after, right? Is saying the who, right? The what of Jesus is fully human. The who is God. And so how do you kind of hold those together fully? And that's really what we're after. And at some point, I think it's hard to do again, in kind of speculative storytelling fashion. It's easier to do with metaphysics, but it's, I think, important on both those levels.
Yeah. So, kind of on that, a lot of people might be shocked to learn that Jesus learned anything, but that's even in scripture itself, that he did learn. So, if this is your approach for who Jesus is, you're giving a sort of account for how Jesus could have a divine self-understanding. Let's go the other direction. I just want to ask, when you're dealing with scholars from historical Jesus, what are the ways that they have all these different things? How do they think Jesus understands himself? And what do they do with these supposedly divine claims in scripture?
So yeah, they do many different things. There are a couple of approaches, but broadly, what they're looking for is parallels around Jesus' time of kinds of similar types of figures. And then they try to sort of paint Jesus as that kind of figure. Right. So Jesus was a kind of cynic sage. Jesus was one of these kind of apocalyptic prophet. Jesus was this sort of political messianic figure, right, who was just trying to overthrow the Romans. So that's often how historians are proceeding, and that's really helpful in as far as it goes, right? That I think that Jesus, it's important to see that Jesus was picking up a lot of ways of acting that other people had acted in his day. I think otherwise people wouldn't have known to follow him or had any context for what he was doing, right? But he's also often subverting those things, right? So they're saying, are you Elijah or are you this? And he kind of says yes and no in a sense, or I'm also doing this, or you guys don't quite get it. And so I think it's interesting because historians are also trying to put themselves in the place of those people, and sort of figure out, like, who is this guy? What's he trying? Who's he trying to be? So there's a lot that's really, really helpful in this scholarship. I hope I've emphasized enough that a big part of the book is to say we have to do this critical scholarship, but we just have to realize it's not as objective as we thought. And so those kinds of things are really useful because they illuminate both sort of that context of stuff Jesus says and also what his followers thought about him. And so the historians are really picking up on that kind of stuff and saying, oh, we have these other figures who said similar kinds of things, and the followers sort of thought similarly. But they'll often then push that all the way and just say, well, that's just what Jesus was, right? So he just like these other figures, he did the exact same thing, and this is what he was doing. And so they'll say, Jesus actually was just trying to overthrow the Romans. We don't have a ton of that in the Gospels, but he surely was saying more about how he was just building an army and he was just going to overthrow them. And then they caught wind and they killed him. A lot of particularly the people who, like, as I said, the people who kind of follow Vereda methodologically and say, let's begin by deciding what bits of the Gospels are historical, and then whatever we've decided, let's put that together into a story. Often they focus primarily on Jesus' sayings. So a lot of the stories, a lot of the action, they'll leave out and say that's not historical. But the things Jesus said, they'll say some of that is real. And so then they give us a Jesus who is just about saying things, right? So that's the sort of Jesus understood himself as a teacher, as a sage. And then they'll tell a story about Jesus as someone who kind of had these wise aphorisms that he wanted to kind of walk around and share with people, right? So it depends on sort of what you decide is historical, that then you kind of tell these stories. And I think that often, they illuminate something about Jesus. But what the theological tradition has always tried to do is say, there's more, though, right? He's always subverting this in some way, and a lot of these things all point together to something more. And I think if we take what I think the way that I have to think about it, right, is that when a sort of, say, like a patristic theologian is reading the Gospels, and when a modern historical Jesus scholar is reading the Gospels, the patristic theologian is saying, what if this was true? What would it mean, right? And so they're going the further step, and they're saying, oh, what if there is a God, and what if this is the case about reality? How does that impact how we understand this? And the modern historian was never going to ask that question. They can't, right? That's not allowed. And so that I think that further step is where Christianity gets this kind of deeper sense of how Jesus understood himself. Whereas historians then always, I think, end up stopping a bit short. And we do get some really extreme versions of this, like modern historians who see Jesus as this, kind of weird gay magician or like whatever, there's all kinds of stuff out there in terms of what people have claimed about Jesus. But I think
Did you say gay
I'm
magician?
gonna need to hear more about the weird gay magician.
well, yeah, so these are
Is this the secret Gospel of Mark, or what is this?
yeah, I think I forget what they named the fragment, but there's, around the time of Jesus' crucifixion, there's that person that pops up in one of the Gospels who's just wearing a loincloth and then like runs away naked. And so there's been a big thing about certain scholars have said, oh, that was actually Jesus' lover, and the kind of he wasn't doing miracles, but he was a magician like these other magicians, and so they're taking kind of bits and pieces, really running with them sometimes. So that's like one sentence with no context in the Gospels. But there have been a couple scholars who built like their whole understanding of Jesus on that. And then
So,
yeah,
just real quick. So, God is not a possibility, but gay magician is.
that's right. Yeah. So there are many, many, many possibilities. Everything's on the table as long as it's not sort of divine.
Just want to make sure I was hearing this correctly.
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, it's really interesting. A lot of the scholarship is really interesting because you're like, this is some crazy stuff here, and it's really it reveals a lot always about the scholars, right? About the sort of state of scholarship at the time, and I think one thing that I learned as well from reading all these books was this question of objectivity. I think is a really interesting one because basically what we do as historians is we sort of set a sort of methodological standard, and it's possible to set that standard so high that the past disappears. And so that's the good way of thinking about Jesus mythicism. People who say Jesus didn't exist is they've just set a methodological standard so high that none of the evidence for Jesus can pass it, but also none of the evidence for most of the ancient world would pass it. So most of the past would disappear if you also claim Jesus didn't exist. And so right, the question is just like, well, what's our standard? How much do we need to be able to prove these things? And we're often holding the Gospels to a much higher standard than kind of any other historical sources. And I mean, fair enough because they're really important. But I think, just realizing that's not we can't prove what happened in the past by doing that. We just show that this is what we would like to be able to know, and then a lot of the past kind of disappears because we just can't do it. So in the midst of that uncertainty, a lot of people kind of come up with a lot of stuff to fill in, and basically what we see is historical Jesus scholarship very often has simply been, can I tell a different story than the Christians are telling? And can I do it in a way that's kind of compelling or significant for the political moment? I mean, you can see, the scholars, especially the ones sort of saying Jesus was gay. They're in a very particular context in the U.S. where that's an important political question, and so looking for sort of to be able to bring Jesus on side. But that's happening for most of these scholars at various points. And I think it's important to recognize that Christians do this too. So we read Jesus in ways that make him support what we already like. We're not always very critical about actually caring who Jesus actually was and what he actually had to say, right? And I mean, certainly in America, everything he has to say about money is sort of swept under the rug, and we only care about the other stuff that he says. So, seeing this across the board as, this is why people care about being able to do this critically, but it's really complicated. And so what I'm advocating is just let's do a better job at accounting for that complexity, and hopefully we can sort of continue to do that better going forward.
Tell us if you need to go, but well, building off of this, it's not just naturalists or non-Christians who are doing this, but Christians have their own ways of doing it. What do we think of things like historical Jesus arguments? From the popular level, like Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ, and these other types of things. I mean, what would your framework have to say to those types of things? Are they attempting?
Yeah, so the kind of apologetic arguments, the kind of historical arguments about Jesus, I think, I mean, I personally feel like it's extremely rare that someone comes to faith in Christ because they're convinced that the evidence suggests that this has to, be true. So I think that the historical evidence can be necessary but not sufficient usually for faith. So if people think there's no good historical reason to think that the Gospels, what they say happened, they're probably not going to, become Christians. But if they think, oh, there's some good historical reasons, but they're going to need a lot of other reasons too. And so sometimes these kind of apologetics conversations proceed as if they're saying, we can prove objectively that Christ rose from the dead, and therefore you have to believe in it. And I find that very strange and kind of troubling. And no, they can't do that. I don't think. But what they can do is say there's a plausible case to be made that this happened. That there's not sort of, or essentially you can't prove that it didn't happen historically. And I think that's true, right? I think, but partly just because it's hard to prove objectively that much did or didn't happen historically. Rather, we have sort of ranges of plausibility in light of, varying kind of source material that we have. So I would tend to be much more in the kind of gray in terms of what we can prove. And I think that the sort of, as Christians, it matters to us that this happened, but that we can't know that it happened in the way that we can know, scientific observations about the natural world, for example. It's a different kind of knowledge. It's a different sort of level of certainty. And to my mind, I think that's just how faith works anyways. Yeah, so I think, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are people who have found those things helpful, but I think that they often lead us to think that we're Christians because we're smarter than people. We're Christians because we know stuff they don't know, and that's not true. That's not sort of what it means. So, yeah, that's kind of how I think about that. What do you guys think?
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. You said that we can't know about it in the way we can scientific truth, but basically, from what you've been saying, it just sounds like that's just true of any historical event. Or,
It,
we can't know Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in the same way that we can know the size and weight of an atom or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think in general, and what's interesting is most historians like really get that and talk that way, but historical Jesus scholars have tended to not talk that way. So they often sort of say, like, this is the case, this is what happened. Whereas most other historians sort of say, there's a range of plausibility here. It could have been this, could have been that. And they're fine with that kind of being open. And I'm not the first person to say this, but it's actually quite frequently historians from, with other kind of discipline specialties are saying historical Jesus scholars need to stop acting so certain about this stuff. We're historians, we're never working with that kind of certainty.
Yeah, and it seems like as well, like, if you are trying to make an apologetic case for this, it seems like if you're wanting to say it, you might be like, hey, here's a set of historical facts or something like that most people agree on. We're not 100% certain, but if you assume that these are correct, then maybe Christ's resurrection can explain these pretty well, and other naturalistic hypotheses don't explain that. That's a lot more mild than just saying, look at this. This is as much of a proof as, say, like the ontological argument.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, N.T. Wright's book on, the resurrection, I think is a really interesting argument. And you could say that strikes me as a plausible possibility. And I think that's kind of as far as we can get in terms of, and are there other equally plausible explanations? Maybe, maybe not. But that'd be the realm that you're in, I think, with those kinds of arguments. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. Can I follow up with one other thing?
Yeah.
So, you brought up Jesus mythicism, this idea that Jesus was just a myth. He did not exist at all. That has seen this kind of big rebirth online lately from sort of these new atheists, and even after that, this idea is just getting floated everywhere right now. Can you enlighten us on its place in historical Jesus scholarship? Is it taken seriously?
Yeah, so my sense is that most historical Jesus scholars don't take it seriously. I mean, famously, Bart Ehrman certainly doesn't take it seriously, and he's, a kind of major skeptic about a lot of things. And again, it comes down to it takes off online because you have a lot of people very dissatisfied with Christianity at the moment in the US because of its political associations, and so they love the idea that they can just disprove it using kind of scientific methods. And they're not really interested in the facts of that. They're just interested in, the way that it can be used rhetorically. But if you look into it, I mean, just as Jesus mythicists, yeah, they're saying, here's my standard for if this figure could have existed, and the standard is ridiculously high, and so so much of the past disappears according to that standard as well. And then you could say, okay, fine, but basically then you need to be willing to say, we don't know what happened in the past. Basically, pre like 1000 AD, we don't know anything that happened. And if that's where you want to stand, then okay. But that doesn't mean you proved Jesus didn't exist. You just mean we don't know that anything existed. And I think that would be sort of where you have to land. And it's like, okay, so it's like an extreme skeptic position, right?
Which opens space for the creationists to jump in and say, well, if you don't know what happened before 1000, let me tell you.
That's right.
We got
yeah,
a book for that.
Got to the gaps there.
I mean, it's a bit of a joke, but at the same time, there's this distance in all forms of knowledge to greater or lesser degrees, because it's not just difficult to reconstruct a historical event that you didn't see. How do you reconstruct geological events? And I think you can do that with more certainty, perhaps, but it's still, you're reconstructing something and you're having to impose frameworks to make sense of things that you're not actually seeing. And even the example Seth used of the weight and size of the atom, I think we can have a very good sense of those things, but we also can't physically see an atom.
Yeah, we can.
Well, not in the same way you could see other things. I mean, you're postulating it based on interpreting, like,
no, you
sensors,
can see an atom now,
but you can't actually see it. They're having to recreate the image in a way that
they can see him now.
Damn it, Seth! How dare you embarrass me in front of my friends?
But in general, what you're saying, I think, is it stands that so much. One of the things that when Christians use a kind of God of the gaps thing to be like, any time we can't know something for certain, we sort of fill it with God and therefore have certainty. And I would certainly want to say to Christians, like, that's not a Christian understanding of knowledge. Like, you're taking an extreme enlightenment form of sort of insisting that we have absolute objective knowledge about everything. And so I have a whole chapter in my book of kind of Aquinas's cognitive theory and epistemology, and sort of saying, from the classical Christian tradition, we have a pretty strong sense of the subjectivity of knowledge in general, and that's important, actually. And so I think just when we recognize that our calling as Christians is not to be absolutely certain about every single thing in the world, but rather to be, and I think part of what we do with that then is, so this is where I sort of differ from Seth Heringer has a book where he engages with some of these questions. And it's an interesting one because he uses a lot of postmodern theorists to sort of tear apart modern historicism and say, we can't really know any of these things. And it's a really good book, really interesting arguments. But he kind of says, therefore, we should do boldly Christian history because everybody's just making it up. He doesn't quite say that. That's probably not fair to Seth. But that's at least how some people might take that sort of thing. Whereas I'm saying we should be chastened equally by the subjectivity of our knowledge and not just rush in and boldly make things up, but be aware of how we know things and to what level and on what basis, and be honest about that. I think that's sort of what we're supposed to do. And ideally, professional scholars will do that, and we can do that as well. And then that opens up a space for, I think, a much more responsible conversation about the past that recognizes that, we don't know this in the same way that we might know other things. And actually, we don't know anything in the same way that we usually talk as if we do.
Well, thank you for that great summary and for strategically distancing yourself from young earth creationism and the joke I made earlier.
And Seth as well.
It was a joke.
So, just as a final thought, can you let our listeners know where they can find more from you and your work? And also, just what's next for you? You've got the book out. What are you working on next?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, I think I'm working on various things. The other thing that I do a lot of research on is Christian vaccine hesitancy. So that will be a lot of the things that I have kind of in the pipeline, is finishing up some projects on that. I'm working on a book on the theological virtues that will be for a more general audience. So that would be, much more accessible than this book to maybe a lot of your listeners who aren't academic theologians. But yeah, if they're interested in this book, they can find it anywhere that books are sold. It's from T&T Clark. I have a website, austin-stevenson.com, if they want to check out sort of my other publications. And I also have a podcast called Faith at the Frontiers. Very welcome to sort of check out some of our conversations there as well. We're actually doing a whole series on these questions about faith and the challenges of history right now. But that's kind of what's up next. I'm hoping to follow this up with a monograph, continuing to ask these kinds of questions about historiography. But I'm in my first year full-time teaching, so it'll be a little bit before I get another monograph out, probably.
Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe below, or to check us out on Spotify. And if you want to hear more from this week's episode or guest, our Patreon account has exclusive unaired content, often featuring up to an hour of additional footage and interviews for each episode. We save some of the most controversial and pulse-pounding topics just for our Patreon members. Members get access to that, plus a chance to meet monthly with Jonathan and I, suggest episode topics, join us live for an episode to ask the special guests questions, or even get a personalized episode custom-made just for you. Check out our Patreon link in the description below. And don't forget to check out our official website at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com to see what else you're missing out on. Sound effects from Zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.